Hello and welcome to our Art and Architecture webinar series. I'm Kurt DiCamillo, the Curator of Fine Art at American Ancestors. I will be your moderator and virtual MC for today's event. American Ancestors is a nonprofit organization supported by our members and donors. We are the oldest and largest genealogical society in the world. We specialize in providing resources, research, and expertise that uncover the stories of families, family objects, and family homes. We are pleased to offer such programming for our members and friends around the world. If you have any questions, please feel free to type them into the question panel at the bottom of your screen at any point during today's presentation. We will answer as many as we can at the end. And here's where I tell you that we're broadcasting from our home studios with various limitations. And most likely, if you are listening today, you experienced one of those limitations when we went offline a couple weeks ago when we originally broadcast this. So here's why I also tell you that there will be a tape version of this. You can watch it any time after the live presentation. The women of Castle Howard were not merely decorative figures languishing from boredom or ill health, nor were they simply wives whose sole duty was to provide an heir. They were dynamic, combative individuals who wrote, painted, traveled, pursued political careers, all while running several family homes. Today, Chris Ridgway will challenge how we look at the great houses and estates. They were not the exclusive preserve or responsibility of the male members of the family. These historic houses would not exist without the many exceptional women who peopled them. I would like to thank the Joseph and Robert Cornell Memorial Foundation for their generous support of the Art and Architecture webinar series. Christopher Ridgway has been the curator at Castle Howard since 1985. He's lectured on the house, its history, and collections around the world, and published extensively. Chris is chair of the Yorkshire Country House Partnership, a collaborative research project among the houses of the region, and is adjunct professor at the Centre for the Study of Historic Irish Houses and Estates at Maynooth University, part of the National University of Ireland. He also sits on the board of the Irish Heritage Trust, and in 2019 was awarded a UK Lifetime Achievement Award. His recent publications include Castle Howard and Brideshead, Fact, Fiction, and In Between, and New Walls for Old Pictures, Country House Collections, Their Past, Present, and Future. Please join me in welcoming the great Chris Ridgway.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Kurt, for the introduction. And it's a great joy to join you virtually in Boston, your lunchtime, and it's a chilly spring evening here in the UK. Well, traditionally, the history of Castle Howard has been defined in terms of these individuals you see, all men who may be summarized as builders, collectors, politicians, and artists, and in the 20th century, figures who rescued Castle Howard after the catastrophic fire of 1940 and reversed years of decline. In one sense, this is a perfectly acceptable narrative, and each of these male representatives from the 10 generations or so of the family who have occupied the house since it was first built in 1699 has a rich and important history to relate. But it would be perfectly possible to present a different cast of characters, an all-female one, and each of these individuals would have a story to tell every bit as complex and detailed as that of their male counterparts. They may not have raised buildings or acquired old master paintings or sat in Parliament, but their lives were as accomplished in other ways. Now, I've titled this talk Heroines and Harridans, and some of these figures were indeed courageous in a variety of ways, while others have acquired reputations that are not very sympathetic. As usual, the picture is far more complex than this. None of these 11 women can be summarized as a simple stereotype. These images do not tell the full story, and we have to scratch at the surface to reach a deeper understanding of their personalities. And in order to do this, we need to consider their documentary lives, their lives on paper. And many of these women were involved in managing the estate, monitoring income and expenditure, refurbishing the house, and their lives and responsibilities were more extensive than we might at first suspect. However, in the first instance, we should be under no illusion that aristocratic marriage was about maintaining a dynasty. Marriage and childbirth were essential social and biological mechanisms for perpetuating a family and an estate. Heirs, preferably male, had to be produced to secure succession. But we cannot view these marriage unions purely in terms of arranged matches. Wives were not selected solely on account of their fertility and breeding stamina. Mutual attraction, love, and passion were also prized. And on the evidence of most husband and wife relationships in Castle Howard, the experience of family life was something jointly welcomed and embraced. Now, of course, marriage agreements such as these were in one sense purely legal documents, assigning the wife's property to her husband. Dowries in the form of cash or land formed part of an economic contract between two families. And until the Married Women's Property Act in 1882, a woman could not hold property in her own right unless it was held in trust on her behalf. So these singular documents may have established the formal framework of the union between husband and wife, but they don't tell the complete story. It is the countless letters, journals, keepsakes, miniatures, and other documents that begin to open up the true nature of the relationship between husbands and wives. So, for example, here, a letter from Rosalind Stanley to her future husband, George Howard, containing a sprig of jasmine, together with her declarations of love. Or there is the private journal of Charles Howard, recording the sad moment when his wife, Mary Park, died in 1843, just 2 weeks after giving birth to their son, the future 9th Earl. Or a miniature of the 5th Countess by Joseph Saunders, on the reverse of which has been sealed some woven strands of her hair. It's these kinds of items, tokens or declarations with private significances, that cast the sharpest light on the marriage, the family, and the household. But as a rule, mothers were responsible for steering their children towards a suitable marriage. Fathers, together with professional male advisors, would involve themselves in the contractual side, dowries, settlements, and jointures. But it was the mothers who quizzed, encouraged, dissuaded, or reassured their children in their choice of partner. Thus, for example, in 1889, as her daughter Mary, seen here on the left of the picture with her mother and her grandmother on the steps of Castle Howard, as she agonized between two suitors, her mother Rosalind wrote to her, urging her to take her time and delay any choice until she felt sure. "The future is yours if you don't hurry it," she advised. Well, of all the family marriages at Castle Howard, that between Charles Howard and Anne Capel, daughter of the first Earl of Essex of Cassidy Park in Hertfordshire in 1683, was perhaps the nearest to an arranged marriage between two powerful families. But it took place in inauspicious circumstances. Anne's father, Lord Essex, was a prominent Whig politician who became embroiled in the Rye House plot of 1683, a conspiracy to assassinate Charles II and his brother James. Arrested and confined to the Tower of London, Essex cut his throat early in July of that year. Exactly 2 weeks later, his daughter Anne married Charles Howard. At the time of their union, groom and bride were aged 14 and 9, respectively. They did not live together, let alone have marital relations, until some years later. The birth of Henry, the future 4th Earl, in 1694, and a second son, Charles, a little later, meant that the prime imperative of producing an heir and a spare had been accomplished. And between 1695 and 1701, Anne gave birth to 3 daughters, Mary, Anne, and Elizabeth. But by the early 1700s, the marriage had begun to fail. From 1698 onwards, her husband, now 3rd Earl of Carlisle, had become enamored by something else, his grand project, the creation of Castle Howard. By 1704, husband and wife were on the verge of separating. Anne deserted Yorkshire, and Carlisle more or less abandoned London. Residing in the capital until her death in 1752, she lost contact with Castle Howard, and in later years she became a recluse, was a chronic hypochondriac, and became terrified by imaginary ailments. So she might therefore seem to fit that stereotypical image of the wife of an English nobleman, silent, shadowy, unhappy, and simply the begetter of offspring. And certainly her life was not always contented and secure. The trauma of her childhood and the death of her father might explain this. But in an age when birth, infancy, and good health could not be taken for granted, she gave birth to 5 children who all reached maturity. And given that her husband's great vision of Castle Howard was as much about dynastic longevity as it was about architectural and landscaping magnificence, the marriage must be judged a successful one. Well, when Howard and his wife separated, he kept custody of the children and brought them up at Castle Howard. He formed very close attachments to each of his children, but most especially with his 3 daughters. And the first image of these girls, Mary, Anne, and Elizabeth, dates from about 1712, when they were painted in a sparkling triple portrait by the Italian artist Antonio Pellegrini. The 3 girls are depicted at a keyboard making music, one of them actually playing, the other 2 holding sheets of music, quite possibly compositions of their own. The portrait makes no attempt to identify the sisters. They look remarkably alike and appear similar in age. Even their hairstyles are identical. But in fact, by 1711, Mary, Anne, and Elizabeth would have been aged 17, 16, and 11, respectively. So it's clear that the picture was commissioned as something of a marriage portrait, proclaiming the girls' cultural elegance, their wealth, and their equal suitability as potential wives to suitors. Now, identifying the individual daughters from this image is problematic, although 2 of the girls are known from other representations. Their indistinguishable characteristics highlight the limitations of the picture. To understand these girls fully, we need to look somewhere else. And after leaving home, from about the 1720s onwards, each of the daughters wrote to their father regularly, and nearly 250 of their letters survive. Not only does this correspondence reveal the depth of the feeling they felt towards their father, but it also provides a rich insight into their personalities and the world of 18th century aristocratic women. Mary, the eldest daughter, take your pick from the picture here, remained a spinster all her life, and quite which of these is we will never really be able to tell. But the Pellegrini portrait is the only known image of her. It's said that she never married because her father would not supply a suitable dowry. She was linked periodically with various suitors, but these romances came to nothing. She was also a professional invalid who spent her life taking the waters at spa towns such as Scarborough, Tunbridge Wells, and of course Bath, where she once had the misfortune to be chased through the streets by a runaway bull, as you see in the passage here. She sampled a succession of quack cures, and her letters repeatedly express her gratitude to her patient father for paying her apothecary's bills. And in this respect, she may have been closest in spirit to her mother. Anne, the middle daughter, married Francis Ingram, 5th Viscount Irwin of Temple Newsam in Leeds in Yorkshire, in 1718, thereby signalling the first of the great marriage alliances between the Howards and other aristocratic families. And her first marriage was short-lived, as Irwin died of smallpox in 1721, leaving behind mountainous debts incurred from his disastrous South Sea speculations. He had borrowed hugely, and when the bubble burst, he was left with worthless paper. This was negative equity on a grand scale. Well, widowhood forced Irwin to think and act for herself. She had to settle her husband's affairs and pay off his debts, which involved a lengthy legal dispute. And she detested lawyers, calling them terrible creatures, incapable of talking plainly. I did not think it possible to hear English for 3 hours and understand so little of what was said, she complained in 1729. Well, perhaps not much has changed there. But as a widow, she enjoyed her independence, or being mistress of myself, as she termed it, spending most of her time in London, from where she sent her father regular reports on government debates and events at court. In the summer of 1730, she made a tour of Holland and France, travelling on her own and sending back detailed accounts of what she had seen. In 1732, her poem, Castle Howard, was published anonymously. It was received favourably, but she particularly enjoyed the fact that nobody could detect who was the author, but all assumed that it was a man. And in 1736, she was appointed Lady of the Bedchamber to the Princess of Wales. Well, at times, Anne comes across as prim and moralistic, something of a blue stocking, but her letters also reveal her to have been articulate and witty. She was more educated than many of her fellow courtiers, but was sensible enough to know how to keep her own counsel. She was prudent with her finances, and her economic independence allowed her to refurbish her London home in some style in the 1730s. Although she liked to dismiss herself as a silly widow, Anne is an example of an independent woman. Devoted to her father, she nevertheless chose to marry for a second time in 1737 without his permission and incurred his displeasure. After years of living on her own, it was not grand passion, but close companionship that she was seeking in her marriage to Colonel Douglas, as she explains in a touching letter to her father. I'll read the extract here. Good hours and home I have ever loved, nor are they inconsistent with my situation at court, but always, or at least for a generality, to eat alone, to come home in an evening to nobody, or if I would have company, to be obliged to look for it out of my own house, is not agreeable. And in many ways, this is quite a professional, quite a modern sentiment, I think. Well, with no desire for an extravagant lifestyle, the couple lived comfortably and modestly on joint incomes, and even declined an offer of money from Carlisle, who eventually relented and received the newlyweds in Yorkshire, where he must have realised how balanced his middle daughter was as an intelligent, dispassionate observer of the world. Well, by contrast, Elizabeth, the youngest daughter, was also the wildest. In 1725, she exhibited a self-destructive streak when she lost enormous sums gambling at Bath, and then tried to take her own life by swallowing laudanum. 2 years later, she was widowed when her husband, Nicholas Lechmere, suddenly dropped dead of apoplexy. But within a year, she married Sir Thomas Robinson, the amateur architect who was to complete the building of Castle Howard with the west wing of the house. But suffering from what we would call today depression, crippled by low self-esteem and believing that she had lost his affection, Elizabeth's letters to her father implored him to forgive her. And in 1731, she was further distressed when she believed herself to be pregnant, only to discover the diagnosis was incorrect. And she began to suffer fits and hallucinations brought on by incipient alcoholism. So 3 very distinct individuals, each with a different temperament and trajectory through life. Nothing could be further from the anonymity of this Pellegrini portrait. And it's their written words, their documentary lives that provide the richest insight into their personalities. They are a salutary reminder that the mistresses of Castle Howard were not mere faces without inner lives. The irony is that the available first-hand evidence as to their characters is greater than that for their brother, the future 4th Earl. His correspondence does not offer nearly the same insight into character. And today, he's largely comprehended through the objects he assembled at Castle Howard, such as the antiquities in the antique passage. And important and precious as these treasures are, they offer at best an indirect glimpse of the workings of his mind. The same, though, could not be said of his second wife, Isabella, daughter of Lord Byron of Newstead Abbey in Nottinghamshire. Now, Isabella is an appealing character, and her private life encompassed divorce, self-imposed exile in France, and financial embarrassment. And all of these may suggest an unstable personality, but again, the archival evidence challenges this view. Her inner life is minutely recorded through a variety of important documents: her correspondence, her household accounts, her recipe book, and a published volume. And all of these literally speak a great deal about her. In 1743, aged 22, she married the fourth Earl, a man more than twice her age, who had been widowed a year earlier. Carlisle's loneliness and desperation were compounded by the fact that between 1741 and 1743, he lost all three sons by his first marriage, and of his daughters, the eldest, Arabella, would die within 2 years. The pressing need for an heir prompted the Earl to remarry so swiftly, but he was probably captivated by this young woman. In her portrait by the artist Michael Dahl, the adolescent has a somewhat ungainly appearance with rustic cheeks and a prominent jaw, a rather horsey kind of figure. She cannot be classed, I think, as a great beauty, but I think there's a suggestion of an independent, lively mind in this willowy figure with her large, engaging brown eyes. And in dynastic terms, the marriage with Carlisle was a success, lasting 15 years until his death, and during which time Isabella gave birth to 4 daughters and 1 son, Frederick, the future 5th Earl, and all children lived to old age. Well, whilst chatelaine at Castle Howard, Isabella supervised domestic expenditure, and the accounts for 1744 to 55 show how meticulous was her grasp of affairs. The range of neat entries indicates that Isabella was concerned with overall patterns of expenditure and household consumption, and not just for when the family was in residence in Yorkshire. The summaries in her own hand divide into weekly periods and list the principal items purchased together with their totals. And alongside the entries are various marginal comments. You could advance the slide, please. Recording, for example, the cost of refreshment supplied to harvesters in the fields, or the consumption of claret. And we have 2 examples here. She'd marked down, for example, chickens. Lean chickens were 3 pence a piece, or lemons, half a crown a dozen. So these accounts reveal a confident grasp of arithmetic, as well as an ordered mind. And the figures enabled her to compare quantities and prices, as well as weekly, monthly, and annual variations. So this volume tells us that she was someone who took care and pride in her supervision of the household. And so it comes as no surprise to find among the quotations in her later publication, she recommends, "Observe the most regularity in the keeping of your household accounts. It is tranquility to you, justice to your dependents." Well, the most remarkable document associated with Isabella is her manuscript recipe book, compiled over the course of her lifetime and containing more than 200 culinary recipes, medicinal remedies, and household tips. And this volume was begun while she was mistress of Castle Howard. And during this time, the kitchen gardens to the southwest of the house, if you see on the top image, house directly in the center of the screen, the rectangle to the left are the walled gardens. These were enlarged during this time to accommodate extra stove houses and a conservatory for growing fruit trees, pineapples, vines, pomegranates, melons, and cucumbers. The kitchen garden thus became the major source of fruit and vegetable, herbs and flowers for the household. And exotic produce such as pineapples would have been displayed at the dining table as a prestige item, a testimony to horticultural skill and the wealth of the family in being able to support such gardening enterprises. And I appreciate that if we live in Florida, growing a pineapple is not a big deal, but to remember, we're in Yorkshire here. So the homegrown pineapple would have been placed in a centerpiece, such as this comport from a slightly later Crown Derby dessert service. It has a molded ring inside to support the pineapple vertically. But as with all fruit, what couldn't be consumed immediately would have to be preserved or processed. So it comes as no surprise to find that Isabella compiled two recipes for pineapples, one for preserving them and one for making pineapple chips, by which she meant little sugar-coated delicacies. And both would have been invaluable for dealing with the pineapples grown at Castle Howard. Other culinary dishes included how to make sausages, we see here on the left, and these would have been from veal or from pork, from fruit biscuits we see on the right there, and then the very popular mock turtle, which was a dish made out of a calf's head, not really for squeamish 21st century appetites. But these recipes were more than just an anthology of fashionable or interesting dishes. The volume was a practical one, and this knowledge of preserving, pickling, baking, and cooking was supplemented by her understanding of herbs and medical cures, which included recipes for upset stomachs, coughs, and sore throats. Well, Isabella's fulfilled life at Castle Howard came to a close when she was widowed in 1758. Within a year, she remarried, this time to a man 14 years her younger, Sir William Musgrave. At about this time, she sat for a second portrait by Thomas Gainsborough. And beneath the calm surface of this image of an assured, mature woman, confident in her role as mistress of an aristocratic household, there lay a less ordered personal life. The marriage was not a success, and by the end of the 1760s, having formally separated from Musgrave, she decided to leave England, embarking on a peripatetic existence in Europe that would last 13 years. Settling in the south of France near Vaucluse, seen here on the top of the screen, an engraved frontispiece from a volume in her own library, and then on the shores of Lake Geneva at the bottom of the screen, Isabella enjoyed both the climate and the local society, attending concerts and soirees, and even socializing with the family of the notorious Marquis de Sade. And she's also reputed to have met the great French writer Voltaire whilst in Switzerland. During this time, she formed an attachment to a Baron de Venheim, who, in the eyes of her family, was little more than a French confidence man. And living in somewhat straitened circumstances, she maintained her dignity and occupied her time with copious letter writing, study, reading, and practical occupations such as drawing, embroidery, and upholstery. And after her return to England, she achieved fame as an author. Published in 1789, her book of maxims, or thoughts in the forms of maxims addressed to young ladies on their first establishment in the world, this contained more than 400 precepts and sayings intended to assist young women in their first entrance into the great and critical world. So far, then, we might characterize the 18th century mistresses of Castle Howard as either spirited individuals or poor invalids. And the case of Georgiana, 6th Countess, seen here on the left in a chalk portrait by William Lane of 1807, would seem to fall into this latter category. For in 1848, the wit and clergyman, the Reverend Sidney Smith, a near neighbour in Yorkshire, wrote, "Poor Lady Carlisle is very little calculated to bear up against the storms of life. She has lived all her days in the greenhouse of prosperity and shrinks from the open air." And this judgment returns us to that received view of women stricken by torpor and ill health, languishing in unhappy marriages and sterile households. But was this really so? Georgiana Cavendish was the eldest daughter of the famous Georgiana, 5th Duchess of Devonshire, and her marriage in 1801 to the young George Howard, future 6th Earl of Carlisle, united the great houses of Castle Howard and Chatsworth. and we know a great deal about Georgiana's early life. At the age of 1, she was depicted holding her infant's rattle in a pastel portrait by the artist John Russell. Throughout her life, she remained devoted to her family home and her siblings, William, later the 6th Duke of Devonshire, and her sister Harriet, seen here on the right in a miniature after the artist Richard Cosway. And this closeness stemmed from their unhappy experiences as children when their mother was in exile on the continent for 2 years. But there is one particular item that begins to unlock her personality in a unique manner, and that is her school book, dating from when she was aged 15. This itemized her educational routine. A reading is recorded, as well as music practice, letters sent and received. And if we look in more detail, we can see her on the left-hand side here with a circle there, reading Shakespeare, recording how she had finished Henry V. In the center, where she is making notes about her daily conversation, and in this particular instance, rather comically recording no conversation worth marking. And there was space for extra observations, which included a comment on her sister Harriet's illness. Harrio, which was how she referred to her, was ill. So this is a really priceless account of the growth of her mind as she passed from childhood to adulthood. But it also prepared her as an acute observer of herself and of others, a pattern that would last throughout her lifetime. Well, there are also a number of other key images associated with her. And the first of these dates from 1784, a year after her birth, when she appeared in a famous double portrait with her mother by Sir Joshua Reynolds. And in this animated celebration of motherhood, Reynolds captured the close, affectionate bond between mother and daughter. The joy of parenthood after nearly 9 years of marriage and several failed pregnancies shines through this portrait. And it's said to capture a moment when the Duchess was singing to her infant daughter, who reacts happily with raised arms. Duchess is depicted as playful, relaxed, and utterly absorbed in her maternal role. Now, more than 30 years later, in about 1815, Georgiana sat for another portrait by the artist George Sanders, by which time she had been married for 14 years and was herself mother to 9 children. In this picture, she's depicted holding a miniature of her mother, which she has just removed from a casket. And in a way, this portrait completely reverses the dynamic of the Reynolds portrait. For her mother, the Duchess had been dead for at least 10 years. So this time, the exchange between mother and daughter is defined in terms of commemoration, as Georgiana casts her mind backward. Somber reflection governs the mood of the sitter, and she's dressed in black, quite possibly in mourning for her grandmother, who had died a year earlier. And Georgiana revered the memory of her mother. She kept her letters, journals, and other writings during the Duchess's exile on the continent in the 1790s. And the Duchess regularly wrote to her family in England and illustrated her letters and journals with scenes and views which Georgiana Jr. kept and treasured. So here, for example, are little thumbnail views of Vesuvius erupting. And other tiny images from this journal and the letters also record a dinner, a masked ball, and a view of Genoa. And we see here one of the heartbreaking little lines in the letters, but yet I cannot enjoy any place or any amusement without you, my darlings. So children were always on the mother's mind, and the absent mother was thought of regularly by the children. So the Sanders portrait, though, points us to another aspect about Georgiana, one that brings us back to Sydney Smith's words. She was indeed afflicted by what we would call depression for much of her life. And part of her struggle against melancholy was, in no doubt, related to her physical health. Between 1802 and 1823, she gave birth to 12 children. So for the best part of 2 decades, she was pregnant on average every 18 months. And it's easy to overlook how onerous this would have been in an age before modern medicine and antenatal techniques. Georgiana composed prayers and undertook various exercises and dietary regimes in an attempt to improve her spiritual well-being. And throughout her life, she wrote a series of memoranda on her own health. So we see at the beginning of this extract here, keep to the rules whether you are ill or well, this idea of governing herself. And some of these journals and memoranda were summaries of her life to date, as when, for example, she reviewed her life in this instance. But others took the form of other revelations. So the most revealing examples of her extensive self-scrutiny are found in these tiny diaries come notebooks, of which only a few survived. And you'll see in the top right there, a 12-inch ruler gives you a sense of the scale of these tiny little books. Now, the coded entries that you see, the zigzag lines, for example, seem to mark her dosages of medicine, as do other sort of hieroglyphs. And they're recording her adherence to the famous Dr. William Cadogan's system of improvement, as prescribed in his popular 1771 publication. But for her, solace was also found in devotion to her husband and in strict religious observance. And it's clear that Georgiana desperately needed to regulate her life, to create disciplines and rules that would be followed. So we see these examples here: strict rules for nervous disorder, struggle with the fiend, rules, and then on the right, occupation, fortitude. So these intimate documents reveal in great detail her inner life. And so if we juxtapose this later entry from 1817 on the right, which says, "My confinement after the birth of my 10th child," if we juxtapose that with the portrait of her with two of her children by the Yorkshire artist John Jackson of a few years earlier, I think a very poignant perspective on motherhood emerges. And ultimately, it was this self-effacing quality, this immersion in service to others, to duty, that enabled her to conquer her melancholy. And as her husband's health declined, and after his death in 1848, Georgiana assumed greater control in the running of Castle Howard. She's seen here in a portrait by Robert Thorburn, executed 2 years before her death in 1858. And she's very much a Victorian mater familias. Her domestic correspondence provides the strongest proof of her energy and commitment to the household. She redecorated the interiors with chintzes and wallpapers. She ordered new carpets and reupholstered much of the furniture. And no detail escaped her attention. She warned against the smells of fresh paint. She ordered double glazing for the winter. When prayer books in the chapel became too tattered, she had them replaced. Where possible, old beds and curtains were reused in servants' rooms, and she became a tireless compiler of inventories and picture catalogues. Outdoors, she became irate when trees were felled without her knowledge, and she donated £50 towards the rebuilding of a local church. And then, as Dowager Countess of Carlisle, Georgiana welcomed Queen Victoria to Castle Howard in 1850. But she never forsook her duties as a mother, and she monitored the development of her children equally scrupulously. Her youngest daughter, Mary, was painted by John Jackson in 1829, aged 6. This was an image any parent would be proud of. But beneath the angelic appearance was a less disciplined child. In the same year as this portrait, Georgiana had grown so concerned that she began recording Mary's behavior, noting when she had been disobedient, quarrelsome, and peevish and troublesome. But also she made remarks on improvements. So you are left with the choice here with the portrait and the journal, Little Angel or Little Monster. And here again, the documentary material challenges any simplistic reading of the visual evidence. So from what we have seen so far, it would appear that the women of Castle Howard gradually grew in stature and activity as the 18th and 19th centuries progressed. And with each successive generation, not only does the wealth of images increase, there are quite simply more paintings, drawings, engravings, and of course, before long, photographs depicting these individuals, but the body of documentary material also increases in volume, making it easier to explore their lives and personalities. And in a way, this narrative reaches its climax with the figure of Rosalind Howard, the 9th Countess, at the end of the 19th century. Now, Rosalind was someone who displayed titanic energy and industry, but history has judged her severely. She's been regarded as a Victorian Harridan, the typical battle axe who bullied her husband and children and engaged in bitter disputes with anyone who challenged her opinions or authority. That is not the whole picture. Born in 1845, Rosalind was one of 9 children belonging to the Stanley family of Alderley Park in Cheshire. Her parents were active supporters of the Whig cause, or the Liberal Party, as it became known by the 1860s. And thanks to this family background, Rosalind was well educated. She was widely read, familiar with intellectual discussion, used to the cut and thrust of political debate. She was fluent in French, German, and Italian, and she was an accomplished singer. Well, in 1863, Rosalind met the young George Howard, and a year later they married. And the couple shared a love of art, literature, and music, and immersed themselves in London society. And her early letters to George are a touching record of a passionate love affair between 2 high-minded, idealistic young people. In time, this correspondence, lasting more than 40 years, would record family divisions, personal unhappiness, and the gradual extinction of their love. But these letters also chart the development of her mind as she abandoned conventional religion, argued for the equality of men and women, and fashioned her own public life around causes she believed in passionately. On the other hand, her husband's replies, while containing some similar instances, are more limited. He clearly felt more able to express himself through his drawing and painting as an amateur artist. So from time to time, he enclosed small sketches of Rosalind in his letters, which illustrated the depths of his feelings. So we see here on the top left, a little ink sketch, the last thing I saw before leaving home, as Rosalind pulls on her stockings. In the center, a long kind of little sort of description of her. She's dressed in her underwear. And then on the right, a rather exotic picture of her as a nude holding the latest fashionable lamps that could be bought in London. Well, in their day, these little drawings were somewhat risque, and Rosalind referred to them, or at least one of them, as naughty. But these intimate images question any stereotypical view of Victorian marriages as repressed, frigid liaisons. They illustrate a loving and sexually fulfilled marriage, including this particular example with its rather coy commentary. With her back turned to him, with the bedclothes over her, we have probabilities. But on the other side, below, we have the picture of her unclothed, lying back on the bed, naked, and possibilities. Well, if we're surprised by these little drawings, it's because they don't fit our received understanding of the period. And very significantly, is clear evidence that Rosalind ordered these letters with her husband and preserved them for posterity, which in turn says something about her own response to these images. The fact that she was not moved to destroy them meant that she valued their existence in the record of her correspondence with her husband. Over the course of 19 years, Rosalind gave birth to 5 daughters and 6 sons. In 1882, pregnant for the 10th time, she wrote, "My vital energy is sapped. These babies are too much for me, and I have grown quite stupid and without a particle of energy." But she was not content with being just a chatelaine, nor was motherhood alone enough for her in defining a fulfilled life. She ardently believed that her privileged life conferred on her a moral responsibility to work and serve in the public sphere. So in addition to her role as a wife and a mother, she threw herself into a wide range of other activities. And in a letter of 1888, she made clear how she wanted responsibility and recognition in her own right. I too want a sphere, a definite one of my own, which shall make my life have some definite, persistent effort about it. Well, aware that her husband's passion in life was his art, she asked to be allowed to manage the Howard estate, totaling 78,000 acres across the north of England. In time, the strain of running 3 households in London, in Yorkshire, and in Cumbria, and supervising a massive estate business, not to mention caring for her children, would come to exhaust her. To begin with, she was uncertain about her role, fearing it a usurpation of traditional masculine responsibilities. But she immersed herself in day-to-day issues, working closely with her agents, dealing with rents, forestry, farming, cottage improvements, taxation and finances, and welfare issues, such as village schools. In 1889, the couple were dismayed to find that the estates were debt-laden. Agricultural recession and falling rents, as well as a desire to carry out repairs and improvements, meant that economies had to be implemented. And a year later, Rosalind oversaw the sale of the Northumberland estates. And then in 1892, on the bottom right, not for the first time, she sent a letter to her tenants granting them a rent rebate owing to the poor economic climate. And she insisted on personally working through this mass of paper, the accounts and the memoranda. And these memoranda could range from cowsheds to footpaths, to building repairs or dead tenants, tree felling, chapels, trespassers. She saw it as her duty to oversee this massive detail, to otherwise would have been irresponsible. And litigation held no fears for her either. In 1907, she went to the High Court in London in a lawsuit with tenants over a water supply on the estate in Cumbria. And Rosalind described herself as agent for her husband when she was cross-examined by Sir Edward Carson, the brilliant Dublin-born lawyer who had famously destroyed Oscar Wilde at his trial in 1895. In the witness box, Rosalind battled with Carson, prompting laughter in court, and at one point he had to remind her that she was there not to question him, but quite the reverse. And the image in the daily graphic paper on the top right captures something of her energy, walking and talking volubly at the same time. Indeed, Rosalind and Carson would find themselves on opposite sides of an altogether more serious matter just a few years later. But local affairs led to national issues too. Rosalind was concerned by the lack of sobriety among the tenants on the family estate in Cumbria and its destructive effect upon families. She formed abstinence societies, held temperance meetings, closed down pubs, and opened a coffee house. And she had some success in persuading tenants and publicans to give up drink. But often those who signed the pledge lapsed in their good intentions. At the bottom of the screen, we can see there ringed how early in the 1880s she took the pledge, and her husband, and indeed most of her children, joined her in abstaining entirely from alcohol. But then tensions arose with those of her sons who chose not to follow this course. Household became fiercely teetotal. Even guests were not served wine at dinner. And many of the temperance societies were driven by a religious enthusiasm, and pledge cards would help invoke the help of God or contain supportive quotations from scripture to help resist the temptation of alcohol. The Blue Ribbon Army card here, designed by her artist friend Walter Crane, depicted St. George vigorously slaying the dragon of drink. And Rosalind was pleased with this image of the nation saint ridding Albion of this deadly scourge. Well, Rosalind's campaign against alcohol caused a national furore in 1916 when the Daily Express reported how she had destroyed hundreds of bottles of wine at Castle Howard. Now look at the headlines on that newspaper, all to do, the first 4 ones reading from left to right, all to do with various theatres of war. And the 5th one is 1,000 bottles of wine wasted. So implicit in this criticism was the suggestion that the wine could have been donated to convalescing soldiers. Well, there's no reason to doubt Rosalind's forthright response to this unwelcome publicity. She fired off a letter back to the editor, explaining how the wine had quite simply gone off. Here we see how the whole story made the front page of a national newspaper. In the end, in her letter, Rosalind rebutted the story furiously, writing to the editors to explain the so-called wine in the 800 bottles that had been thrown away was sour stuff, condemned as worthless and undrinkable. Not even a dipsomaniac under the influences of his worst drink craving would have touched this mixture of fungus and smelly liquid. Well, notwithstanding her angry protest, the story of Rosalind and the wine remains one of the most single famous anecdotes about Castle Howard. And along with Temperance, Rosalind's other great crusade in life was women's suffrage. In 1869, she read philosopher John Stuart Mill's volume On the Subjection of Women, and her breathless diary entry signals how this was a defining moment in her life. "I go with him in every word he says," she wrote. "He is a wonderful champion for women's causes. It has roused me to care more about women's liberty." She worked tirelessly for local women's liberal associations, and these groups affiliated into a national liberal women's federation, which Rosalind joined only after it started to advocate women's suffrage, and in time she became the president. For Rosalind, the direct action tactics of suffragettes, founded by Emmeline Pankhurst in 1903, was counter to all that she believed in with regard to steady political progress. Rosalind was a suffragist, not a suffragette. The constitutional means of change are what she believed in. So when suffragettes invaded the House of Commons or attacked Lloyd George's home, or in 1913 when Emily Davison threw herself in front of the King's horse at the Epsom Derby, Rosalind was outraged. And in 1908 she had written, "It is we, the law-abiding, patient, constitutional, all-round reforming women who are winning the day, and the impatient, lawless, scolding women with hate in their hearts are only setting our cause back. Such methods shrivel up the souls of human beings and make them reckless, heartless, mad egoists." And there is a contemporary cartoon in Punch there of the shrieking sister. And you can see from Rosalind's words, not only was she passionate about the cause, but she could write very strongly as well. And indeed, it's ironic on the right of the screen here that in 1913, the local newspaper should report a scare at Castle Howard with 2 suspected activists staying in the vicinity. This was the time when suffragettes were setting fire to country houses. And if Rosalind held the suffragettes in contempt, it's clear some of them were not prepared to respect her contribution to the cause of women's suffrage. And while Rosalind may once have described herself as a politician, she never could hope to become a publicly elected representative of the people. Her correspondence, though, shows her to have been always abreast of events. She read the newspapers avidly. Her sons, who were in Parliament, she would discuss with frequently, and she would comment unflinchingly on current affairs. So she revered Queen Victoria, and in the year of the Jubilee in 1897, she wrote warmly of her reign as a good and faithful servant to the nation. However, she held the rest of royalty and aristocracy in low esteem, and she shunned London society. Her political opinions were trenchant, and she once wrote, "I was brought up in a fierce Whig atmosphere. We had no dealings with Tories." She abhorred British imperialism and was fiercely opposed to the Boer War in 1901-1902. And whilst pleased when both Mafeking and Ladysmith were relieved, she was appalled at the treatment of Boer women and children incarcerated in camps. And Rosalind remained a liberal all her life, but some of her actions suggest that she might have shared the political sympathies of the newly forming Labour Party, which had been founded at the end of the 19th century. Now, although she did not agree with socialism, she repeatedly showed her sympathy for striking workers, whether they were confectioners at Barrett's factory in 1890, Scottish railwaymen in 1891, or miners in 1893. And in many cases, she sent substantial donations towards the strike funds. She also felt that England was divided between a wealthy, irresponsible elite, and much of the population was suffering from poor wages and harsh working conditions. And in July 1914, Rosalind made possibly her most controversial political statement ever. She sent a donation of £300 to the Irish National Volunteer Movement. She had long been a supporter of Home Rule for Ireland, believing that the Union of 1800 should be abolished and Ireland be allowed to govern itself from Dublin. And this was an issue that had bedeviled British politics since Gladstone had introduced his Home Rule Bill in 1886. A second bill failed in 1893, but the motion was introduced in Parliament for a third time in 1912. Ulster Unionists were, of course, fiercely opposed to this measure, and their leaders, in particular Sir Edward Carson, Rosalind's adversary in court from a few years earlier, organised themselves into armed opposition, forming the Ulster Volunteer Force. And reviving the old slogan, "Ulster will fight and Ulster will be right," the Unionists signed their famous covenant to defend Ireland and protect the northern counties, as seen in the top right here. But in response to these Unionist displays of force, the Irish National Volunteer Movement was formed, like their northern counterparts, who had shipped weapons into Ulster. So the nationalists looked to arm themselves. And this is a picture on the right of the landing of arms at Howth, just north of Dublin, in that summer. And in a letter, Rosalind described herself as an advocate of peace and an anti-armament politician. Well, notwithstanding this protestation, she can have had no doubt that the funds would have been directed towards buying arms, as was the case when that shipment landed near Dublin. And the Irish Times all but accused her of this in their headline, "Money for Guns, Countess of Carlisle, a subscriber." Well, from 1914 onwards, it was impossible, of course, for anyone to escape the slaughterhouse of the Great War. Here was a war that Rosalind believed had to be fought to the finish in order to defeat German aggression. And like many, she paid a heavy price. In 1916, her young secretary, James Mitchell, was killed. And a year later, her own son, Michael, who had enlisted as a private in order to get to the front sooner, was reported missing in action. This is the telegram from the War Office on the bottom left. And this was at Passchendaele. A year later, he would be confirmed dead. And Rosalind's writings for these later years, in 1910 she turned 65, they show little sign of any loss of energy or spirit. And her obituary in 1921 described her as a fearless champion of causes. Well, there's no real clue to this radical personality in Frederick Leighton's portrait of Rosalind of 1865 in the centre of this composite array of pictures, or many of these other images. We perceive a privileged, elegant woman, but we lack any biographical element in these pictures. This we uncover through the letters, the journal, the memoranda, and the other papers. So how finally are we to judge all these individuals? By their likenesses, which are varied and intriguing and often of great aesthetic merit, of course, in part. But for the stuff of life, we have to look somewhere else. And fortunately, most of these women left an enduring legacy in the body of their writings, their letters and diaries, their estate, household, financial, or political papers. It is these items that give voice to their lives, and the story they tell is largely the same, namely that these women, interesting and complex characters, and they were intimately and actively bound up in the management and welfare of Castle Howard. So thank you very much.
Chris, thank you so much for that fantastic presentation. Before we get to your questions, we have some upcoming programs that I'd like to mention. On May 2nd at 6 p.m., Natalie Dykstra, who wrote Chasing Beauty, the Life of Isabella Stewart Gardner, will be in conversation as part of our American Inspiration series. On May 16th, I will be hosting Nathaniel Taylor on a discussion of heraldic decorative arts in colonial and revolutionary America on May 28th. I'll be giving a presentation myself called The Cock and Lion, French Design in British Historic Houses. And then finally, on May 3rd, we have an online presentation, actually an in-person presentation here in Boston about the influence of Jane Austen and the English country house. You can register for all of these events on our website, and you'll also receive from Ginevra today in the follow-up email links where you can go directly and register for those as well. Now, let's go ahead and get to your questions. Go ahead and type as many of them in as you can, and in the time provided, we will answer as many as we can. And I'm going to start with the first one, which is that lovely portrait of Isabella Byron a pastel?
No, that one is not. That's an oil, actually, by Michael Dahl. It's not actually at Castle Howard. It's at Naworth Castle, which is now in another branch of the family. So it's not on public view. And I only discovered it about 20 years ago when Philip Howard showed it to me. So, I mean, I have to confess in a rather strange way, I rather fell in love with this horsey looking girl many years ago. But there's a kind of animated character there, which I think is quite appealing.
Ruth asks, which Howard woman's history was the most surprising to you and why?
Um, I think they were all pretty surprising because I mean, in a typical way, when I began researching these women, maybe 20 odd years ago, I probably had that kind of boring, unpardonable male stereotypical view. Oh, they can't be as interesting as the men, and so all the time there was a revelation. I think probably I mean, Isabella was great because of the recipe book. I mean, Georgiana because of those struggles with her kind of her spirits. I didn't really talk about the fifth Countess, who has some heartwarming letters to her husband when he's sent to negotiate with American colonists in 1778. I think at the end of the day, it always has to be Rosalind, just because of the sheer volume of material that there is associated with her. And my goodness, she can write a really good letter and a very good sort of argument and things like that. Although I suspect she was pretty strong medicine, though.
I don't think there's any doubt about that. Was it common for women to get married at the age of 9?
If you go back further in time, yes, sort of 14th, 15th, 16th century times, you get these sort of extraordinary sounding matches. Obviously, they were not marriages in the way that we understand it between adults today. They were signs of dynastic alliance or political alliance. Those ages sort of they increase, if you like, so that by the 19th century, women are certainly late teens, and if you like, sort of able to form their own independent minds. So, what you would call kind of sort of infant or pre-adolescent marriages grow rarer and rarer in the UK.
Why would a widowed daughter still need to ask the permission of her father to marry again?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, there was no law on that, but it was, if you like, the culture of the time. I mean, there was obviously great deference towards the father, the sort of patriarch of the family, the household. Um, there may have been an element in which obviously her allowance depended upon her father,
Ah,
although as a widow, she may well have had a sufficient jointure from her first husband, although given that she had to settle all his debts, that may not have been the case. So I'm sure there would have been an element of the purse strings attached to that. But I think she wanted to, didn't want to offend him, but this was quite a courageous move. And I think, that quotation I read is very touching of this woman. I think is an extraordinary modern sentiment, of a working person. I mean, being at court was, if you like, the equivalent of being at work, coming home to your own house. It'd be the same today, coming home to your own apartment or whatever. And, if you want friendship, you had to go out for it, or there was nobody there or nobody to share your food with. So I think that was for a mature woman, she obviously was bold enough to do that and tell her father afterwards. And there was obviously her father was sufficiently old fashioned to be displeased to begin with. But I kind of that for me, that's one of the most touching episodes in the whole of the story of the women.
Do you have any idea why the ninth Earl and Countess fell out of love eventually?
There were political differences over Ireland and things like that, and I think part of it was they drifted apart. He was away painting a lot. I don't think they ever sort of lost love in the sense within the bonds of their large family. I mean, they would still gather together, but Rosalind was falling out with some of her sons, particularly if they, as it were, lapsed in their pledge, or they were actually independent enough to say, I want to do this and not that. She was a very controlling personality. So I think after time, people grew tired of her, and that's why she's had quite a negative press over the years. And I can see all of that, but at the same time, there is this astonishingly kind of energetic character and really a very acute intellect, I think.
Do you happen to know what artificial ass's milk is or was?
I don't actually. I mean, and this year, in this day and age, when we can have all sorts of different substitute milks that have not been near a quadruped of any kind, I don't know. I mean, we probably ought to go back and kind of read through the actual recipe itself. But anyway, it was clearly, I mean, something that was popular. So I can't fully answer that in a culinary sense, I'm afraid.
A number of people want to know how many of them are interred at Castle Howard, which is a great way for you to talk about the mausoleum.
Well, a number of them are, and a number of them aren't, quite simply. I mean, the I'm just trying to think through it. The mausoleum is predominantly populated by the men and the brothers. Um, the third countess is not. Isabella is not. The fifth is. The sixth is. There
So
was no seventh because the seventh was a bachelor, and the eighth did not marry either. And then, importantly, Rosalind and her husband, neither of them chose to be buried at the Castle Howard Mausoleum. Their favoured home was the Cumbrian home, Naworth Castle, close to the Scottish border, which was a kind of romantic, crenellated building, unlike the kind of Baroque palace that is Castle Howard. They clearly felt more comfortable there. And nearby is Lanercost Priory, and their tomb is actually there. And then if you come through more recently, that when their son inherited Castle Howard, neither he nor his wife were buried in the mausoleum. They actually chose to be buried in the little village adjacent to Castle Howard, the village of Conisthorpe, where indeed you have stayed, Kurt. There's a little rural cemetery there, and they chose to be buried there. And we think that's because this was the first generation of Howards after the title had left Castle Howard.
ah,
And then rather more recently, the granddaughter of Rosalind, Dame Christian Howard, who died in 1999. She was unmarried. She was well known in her time, and I could have talked about her too. She was a prime mover for the ordination of women in the Church of England. When she died, she actually was cremated, and half her ashes went to the sarcophagus in that little rural cemetery where her mother and father were, and the other half in an urn in the mausoleum, which caused the then Dean of York Minster to say, "Ah, Christian, controversial in death as well as in life."
so it sounds like there are only three women from what you said who are actually buried in the
Yeah,
mausoleum in
well,
part.
no, I then need to run that on because Christian's brother, George Howard, who inherited Castle Howard after the war, his wife is buried there and his sister is buried there as well. So yes, there are more women. It's important to remember that the mausoleum has 63 niches, less than half of which are filled.
And of course, you wouldn't even need a niche if you just wanted to have an urn. You could put those, I suppose, anywhere.
You could, yeah. I mean, but actually, the urn for Christian is a tiny little urn in this vast space that would kind of receive a big sort of lead-lined coffin with sort of all the sort of decoration on it. There's just this tiny little urn in this vast space, which is then sealed up with a stone tablet and an inscription. So yeah.
Of course. That is all we have time for, everybody, for questions. If you have any other questions, you can always email us at heritagetours@nehgs.org. Thank you again to Chris, and thank you for joining us today. As you leave the event, you'll have the opportunity to fill out a survey and give us your feedback. As we continue to expand our webinars and online offerings, any and all feedback is extremely helpful and very much appreciated. This free webinar was made possible by the generous support of members and friends around the world. Please consider making a gift to American Ancestors to keep these programs free and to create more programs for you and others to enjoy. Stay safe, stay healthy. I hope to see you soon again on our future online programs. Goodbye for now.